Good morning, afternoon, or evening. How y'all doing today? Welcome back to Morrow's Math Corner. Today we're going to learn how to factor trinomials in the form of x squared plus bx plus c. Please note that in this form, the leading coefficient is 1. All right, so let's get right to this. How do I factor trinomials in the form of x squared plus bx plus c, where b is greater than 0 and c is greater than 0? Well, it's all about steps. First step, our setup. What do we do here in our setup? Well, we go ahead and think about the fact that how did we get x squared? We got that from multiplying x times x. So we're going to go ahead and create two binomials starting with an x in each of them. Because once again, x times x is x squared. Then we're going to ask the most important question in factoring, and that is, what number times what other number equals the variable c, which in this case is 18, but when added together equals the variable b, which in this case is 11. So once again, what times what is 18, but when added together is 11? You got it. If you're a master of multiplication, it's going to be 2 and 9. Now, if you are not a master of multiplication, I suggest you become one. But in the meantime, go ahead and don't get lost and don't get frustrated. Start listing all the different possible factors of this c value, which is 18 in this case, and see which one of them add up to be 11. So 1 and 18, that's not going to add up to be 11. 2 and 9, oh, that is going to add up, and you're done. It's not always going to be the second option. Sometimes it's the fourth or fifth or seventh. That's why it's great to know your multiplication tables. But when in doubt, go ahead and list your factors of the c value and go ahead and add them and see which one adds up to the 11. Now, with regards to the signs of these numbers, it's very, very useful to remember the following patterns. When your given trinomial is x squared plus bx plus c, if you notice everything is positive, that's a simple x plus times x plus setup. When you're given x squared plus bx minus c, that's going to be an x plus and an x minus setup. When you're given x squared minus bx minus c, once again, that's an x plus x minus setup. And last but not least, when you're given an x squared minus b plus c, that's an x minus and an x minus. I always remember that one because a negative times a negative must equal the positive c there. All right, so let's get right to it. The only way we can get better at anything in life is by practicing. So let's go ahead and factor each trinomial if possible. Please note that if not factorable, you're going to write prime as the answer. That is what happens when you are given a polynomial that is unfactorable. Okay, so let's get right to this. For my first trinomial here, I'm going to go ahead and start with my setup, which is r and r. And then I'm going to go ahead and ask the question, what times what is 24, but when added together is 11, and that is going to be 3 and 8. When in doubt, you can go ahead and multiply those polynomials, and they have to equal the original trinomial that was given to you. Number 2, let's go ahead and make my setup. Y squared comes from y times y, and then what times what is 8, but when added together is negative 6. I've got a minus and a plus, so I know my setup is going to be two negatives. That's going to make my life a little bit easier. So I'm going to go ahead and choose 4 and 2 because negative 2 times negative 4 is positive 8, and negative 2 minus 4 is negative 6. Sometimes you're going to be given a squared variable in the beginning of the polynomial and also at the end of the trinomial. So in that case, go ahead and include both variables in your setup. So you have an x and a y, and then x and a y, because x times x will equal x squared, and at the end, y times y will equal y squared. So now that I have the variables out of the way, now let's focus on our question. What times what is negative 20, but when added together is negative 8. This is a minus minus, so I know I'm going to have one of these is going to be a positive, and one of these is going to be a negative. And this is going to be positive 2 and negative 10. Why? Well, because 2 times negative 10 is negative 20, and positive 2 minus 10 is negative 8. All right, let's move on. So, okay, let's go ahead and start with my setup. X and x times x will give me x squared. So what times what is positive 2, but when added together is negative 1? Well, my setup should be a negative and a negative here. And yeah, that's not going to work. You may say, why? Well, if I break down the factors of 2, I've got 1 times 2 will equal 2. But will 1 plus 2 give me a negative 1? No, unless one of them was positive and the other was negative. So in this particular case, this would be prime. It happens from time to time. Okay, now I want to go ahead and incorporate what happens if sometimes you have a GCF. Always, whenever you're factoring, always look for a GCF first. So in this particular case, don't get freaked out with the larger numbers. Step back for a second and say, oh, wait a second. I can go ahead and factor out a GCF of 5 from all of these. So I'm going to go ahead and factor out my GCF of 5, and I'm left with my leftovers of y squared minus 4y minus what is that going to be? 34. 60 divided by 5. 32, sorry about that. 32. So, now let's go ahead and factor my trinomial. I've got y and y. What times what is negative 32, but when added together is negative 4. I know I'm going to have a positive and a negative, and that's going to be positive 4 and negative 8. Why? Because 4 times negative 8 is negative 32, and 4 minus 8 is negative 4. Perfect. Now notice I did make a mistake because I tried to do it in my head, and I first said that 160 divided by 5 was 34, but I verified with my calculator. Even a seasoned professional like myself makes mistakes. So always have your tools ready to make sure and verify. Okay, last but not least, before I start factoring this and get crazy, let's first of all remember that I always want a positive leading coefficient, and I always want to factor out any GCF if possible. And in this particular case, I can factor out a negative 3 from all of these terms. So when I factor out my negative 3, my leftovers are going to be x squared plus 2x minus 8. And now let's try to factor this trinomial. So I've got my negative 3 that GCF has to stay. I'm going to set up my trinomial here. X times x will give me x squared. And then what times what is negative 8, but when added together is positive 2. I know I'm going to have a plus minus, and it's going to be positive 4 and negative 2. Why? Because 4 times negative 2 is negative 8, and 4 minus 2 is positive 2. And there you have it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned a lot. Now we know how to factor trinomials in the form of x squared plus bx plus c when our leading coefficient is 1. Take care now. Come back and watch anytime.